Welcome to Bloomberg Law. I'm Pacchia. The New York Times Sunday business section has run a series of cover stories about law schools. Last month, a story about law school economics took issue with New York Law School in particular. I am now joined by the Dean of New York Law School, Richard Matasar. Full disclosure, I'm an alum of the institution. Dean, welcome. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Lee.
So I'd like to begin where the author of this series of articles started. He said that law schools are lucrative businesses, that they are astoundingly resilient as a business. They're institutions that have power to raise prices and expand in ways that would make any company drool. Have law schools become profit centers? How would you agree with that or disagree with that statement?
Law schools are run to break even. They provide a service for students, which means that the students are coming to the school to get an education. The school's only reason to exist is to provide that education, and they bring in a lot of money, but the money is not turned into profits. There's no shareholders that are going to get a distribution. There's no quarterly report that's going to make its way to the markets for people to judge the organization. It's about generating income to generate education, and schools are good at that. There are differences among schools. There are state universities that subsidize their schools. There are private schools as parts of university that provide some amount of overhead support to the whole university. And there are independent law schools like ours, New York Law School, that essentially exist only for the benefit of their students.
Right, but across the board, tuition for law school over the last 10, 20 years has skyrocketed. It's almost outstripped the pace of undergraduate institutions. Where's the money going?
The money goes largely for what you would imagine it goes for: personnel, for maintaining the facilities of a school, growing its library or maintaining its library, depending on whether the school is ambitious or not. And essentially, it's paying for the services that provide the education to students. The way I like to describe it is when car companies manufacture cars, if they want to generate more resources, the way they do that is to manufacture more cars and sell more cars. Education is a relatively finite resource. Facilities can't be expanded indefinitely. You can't continue to grow your customer base. So price is a natural way that new resources get generated.
So the author of this series seems to come to the point that law school in general is too expensive, but it's particularly too expensive given the market for these graduates when they exit these institutions. Is law school too expensive at this point?
All of higher education is very expensive. The question of too expensive really is a problematic question, because it's too expensive in comparison to what? What are the alternatives that a student has in order to gain the skills they need to become an effective member of society? Education is the primary means in our country and in other places where students can gain that education. It's very expensive to do so. It's an unsubsidized industry. There's no government support, unlike what you see going on in Europe and in Asia, where the government provides a substantial direct subsidy to the educational institutions. And so it's truly a sale of a good to a student. But unlike most sales of good, this one lasts for 50 years. And so if you amortize the cost of an education over the productive life of a graduate, is it too expensive? I don't know the answer to that question. Is it expensive? Yes, it is very expensive.
New York Law School students come out with the second highest debt level for all law schools. Is that a metric that concerns you as a dean of an institution like NYLS?
Well, debt is composed of a couple different components. The first is the cost of tuition of a school, and that's a relatively comparable figure across all the schools in the city of New York. If you look at the most expensive school and the least expensive private school, the spread is only about $4,000 or $5,000, maybe $6,000 in any given year between the most expensive and the least expensive. And over 3 years, that's $17,000 or $18,000 of borrowing. There's also the choice of how a student wants to live while they're in school. New York is the most expensive place to live in the country. Students make a choice: are they going to live at home? Do they want to live in an apartment? Do they want to go out a lot? Do they want to have a more modest lifestyle? So the second component of the debt students take on is the lifestyle that they wish to achieve for themselves. If you back out the cost of living as opposed to the cost of education, the schools are very much more comparable. But students who want to live in Tribeca, where our school is located, are going to pay more for their education and their borrowing expenses than a student who wants to live in Jamaica, Queens. That's just the difference in New York's housing market between one neighborhood and another neighborhood. So in that sense, while we're expensive relative to some other schools, when you begin to look at comparables, they end up being fairly similar in price, very high.
Right. Some say that because law schools are so expensive and the market just doesn't support as many high-paying jobs as it used to in the legal profession, that the legal education system needs to be reformed in some capacity. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, the legal education system needs to be reformed.
How do you go about doing it? I mean, it seems like a gargantuan task.
Well, if you're looking at 200 law schools, you can't do it by being the only law school that decides to disarm themselves unilaterally. If you think about it, a school that chooses itself to not compete with its other schools essentially commits institutional suicide in a marketplace. There's not much price sensitivity among students. They don't shop the difference between school A and school B on price. They shop on the basis of their reputation or ranking. So all schools are in some sense trying to compete against each other on a ranking measure. So it's very hard for a single school to decide that it's going to compete by price in a marketplace where price translates into greater investments on behalf of students, which then translates into increasing the reputation of the school or otherwise increasing its rank. So you don't see a lot of internal pressure on schools to begin to reform. Moreover, we're a regulated industry. And as a regulated industry, there are certain minimum expectations of every law school that create a very high base cost to run an educational institution. Until you see some significant regulatory change, it's going to be very hard for schools generally to lower the price of education.
So if reform has to happen on an institutional level, who ultimately takes the lead? Is this something the American Bar Association should be doing? Someone in the federal government should be taking the lead? How does this happen?
It has to happen on a multi-front discussion. So one place what happens is schools like ours, where we really are aggressively pursuing alternative ways of delivering education and trying to push the regulatory regime all the way to the limit. For example, an accredited law school can't offer more than 12 credit hours using distance learning technologies. Distance learning technologies hold great promise over the long haul of being able to reduce cost. We offer the maximum numbers of hours, and in fact are pushing to try to expand out the kinds of things we can do using distance learning. But the same token, law school is a 3-year box. Almost all law schools offer it as a 3-year program, perhaps a 4-year program, and we're pushing for ways to try to accelerate the time that a student will have through school. Currently, a student needs a bachelor's degree and a law degree. We're seeking permission from the American Bar Association to avoid the full completion of a bachelor's degree before getting a law degree by having a 2-year undergraduate experience and then linking that to 3 years of law school.
Interesting. What do you think the likelihood is of that coming to bear?
Let's see, there's slim and there's none.
Right.
And it rests someplace between those two, unless what we can do is also find a way to offer the BA within that 5-year box, and that's what we're trying to do.
Interesting idea. So last year, law schools nationwide matriculated something like 50,000 students.
That's right.
That's a record. We're also trudging through a pretty serious recession in the legal profession. Do law schools have a responsibility to recalibrate their admission, their class sizes in consideration of the economic conditions that are prevailing in the market?
I think that's a great question. And it's hard to answer the question without really thinking about the perspective of the person who's buying the education, not the perspective of the school that's delivering the education. So we've had a record application year, close to 6,000 people applying to our law school. Of those 6,000 people that apply to the law school, we'll accept the same amount that we usually accept. The student, however, makes the choice about whether they wish to enroll. A couple of years ago, we had actually admitted fewer students than we had in the prior year, and significantly more students decided to enroll at the law school, something we couldn't have predicted and something we had no way of understanding was going to happen. It happened with us. This year we've actually accepted more students and fewer are going to enroll at the law school. We exist in a market, and in a market, any business that's selling anything in that market is likely to respond to consumer demand. So education, when you sort of imagine it in a different way, is two products. There's a product that comes to the consumer of the education. They gain an education. They learn about what it means to be a lawyer. They understand the American legal system. They understand where the American legal system fits in a world regime of regulating businesses and human rights and other kinds of things. That's a valuable, important product that a student is willing to pay for. Independent of that is a second set of transactions that every student has to engage in, which is finding employment after they've graduated from school. That same two-part discussion takes place in a journalism program, in an architecture program, in a business school program, in a philosophy department, in any place in higher education. Law schools have received an inordinate amount of scrutiny on what happens to the graduate of the law school at the other side. And unlike many professions, most of our students find good and gainful employment, and over the long haul have a strong return on the investment they've made in education. A bad economy means students want education. They want education because it helps them to develop the skills that will last a lifetime. To judge whether those skills that last a lifetime have an immediate rate of return on the first 6 months or 9 months or a year after graduation is really a false way of looking at that investment. You need to look at it over a 10-year career or a 20-year career or over a 30-year career, and law has always proven to be a very strong investment in helping someone to gain greater skills, greater values, greater knowledge, things that they can parlay over the long haul into a significant and important career. And so when demand is strong for the education, as it has been, and schools are not lowering their credentials or lowering the quality of the students they're admitting, if a school decides voluntarily to take fewer students, it's not that the students are not going to go to law school, they're just not going to go to that law school, they're going to go to another law school down the street. And that's really what we've seen over the last several years.
That was part one of my interview with New York Law School Dean Richard Matasar. Be sure to check back with us for part two. Also, we should note that we invited the author of the New York Times Law School articles, David Segal, to be a guest, but we have not yet heard back from him. For more on this issue, check out Bloomberg Law's Law School Report and Law Firm Management Law Report. They're both available on BloombergLaw.com and also on the Bloomberg Terminal. I'm Pacchia. Thanks for watching.